Hi. How are you? If you've got your coffee, let's get started. First of all, please subscribe and leave a comment. Chapter Bend. When the light left the world. For the people of medieval Europe, the setting of the sun marked far more than the simple end of the working day. It marked a genuine and closely felt transition into a world understood to be considerably more dangerous, in ways both practical and deeply spiritual, than the world of daylight had been only moments before. Without electric light, without street lamps, and for the great majority of the population without even the modest illumination of a wax candle, night fell across medieval towns and villages as an almost total darkness, broken only by the glow of a banked hearth fire, the occasional torch or lantern of the traveler or a watchman, and the distant, uncertain light of the moon and stars when clouds allowed them to show all. This is the story of what medieval people genuinely feared once that darkness settled in. A fear built from a combination of entirely rational, well-founded concern about the real dangers the dark concealed, and a rich, deeply held body of religious and folk belief that populated the medieval night, with dangers extending well beyond the merely physical. To understand medieval fear of the dark is to understand medieval life itself, since so much of how medieval society organized its laws, its religious practice, and its everyday customs was shaped by this same persistent nighttime anxiety. Chapter Iki, the ordinary dangers of the dark. Before any consideration of ghosts, demons, or the supernatural, it is as essential to recognize that medieval fear of the night rested on an entirely rational and practical foundation, since the darkness genuinely did conceal real and serious danger. Roads and streets, unlit and often poorly maintained, became treacherous after dark, riddled with unseen obstacles, open ditches, and uneven ground capable of causing genuine injury to anyone forced to travel without adequate light. Robbery and violent assault, while not necessarily more common after dark than during daylight hours in every context, were widely understood and confirmed by surviving court records across medieval Europe to carry a particular danger at night, when reduced visibility hampered a victim's ability to identify an attacker or call effectively for help, and when the presence of the town watch, however diligent, could never fully cover every street and alley of even a modest medieval settlement. Wild animals, including inwills, remained a genuine and well-documented danger across much of rural medieval Europe, particularly in more heavily forested regions and during the harsher months of winter when hunger drove predators closer to human settlement, and surviving accounts, legal records, and even artistic depictions from the period confirm that fear of wolf attack, while sometimes exaggerated in later retelling, reflected a genuine and reasonable concern for anyone required to travel between settlements after darkness. This entirely practical foundation of nighttime fear, rooted in the real hazards of darkness, physical danger, and the genuine limits of medieval security and infrastructure underlay and reinforced the deeper, more explicitly supernatural natural fears that this account will go on to explore. Chapter Uch, Fire in the Dark. Among the most immediate and universally shared fears associated with the medieval night was the danger of fire, a threat whose severity in an era of timber, construction, open hearths, and closely packed thatched roofs cannot be overstated. A fire that broke out while a household slept, with its members unaware, and the surrounding town or village equally unprepared to respond quickly in the darkness, posed a genuinely catastrophic risk, capable of destroying not merely a single home, but, given the close construction typical of medieval towns, potentially consuming an entire street or district before it could be brought under control. Surviving town ordinances from across medieval Europe reflect this deep and well-founded anxiety, mandating the careful banking of household fires before sleep, restricting certain trades involving open flame to specific hours or locations, and establishing organized systems for raising a general alarm should fire break out during the night. The particular horror of a nighttime fire, striking a sleeping household with little warning and minimal opportunity for organized response, made this danger one of the most consistently and explicitly addressed fears in medieval civic legislation. A fear grounded in entirely rational calculation, rather than superstition, yet one that shaped medieval nighttime behavior and anxiety as powerfully as any belief in ghosts or demons ever did. Chapter Dart, The Devil and His Servants. Medieval Christian theology held that the hours of darkness carried particular spiritual danger, understood as a time when the devil and the demonic forces under his command were believed to hold greater freedom to tempt, torment, and directly assault the souls and bodies of the faithful. This belief was not a marginal folk superstition existing at the fringes of official religious teaching, but was substantially reinforced by the Church's own theology and popular preaching, which frequently emphasized the particular spiritual vulnerability of the nighttime hours and encouraged faithful toward specific protective prayers and religious observance before sleep. Surviving sermons, religious guidance literature, and popular devotional texts from across the medieval period consistently urge believers to commend themselves to God's protection before retiring for the night, reflecting a genuine and widely shared concern that the darkness offered demonic forces a particular opportunity to work harm upon the sleeping or the spiritually unguarded. This theological framework gave shape and specific religious meaning to a broader, more diffuse human ordinaries regarding the dark, transforming ordinary nighttime anxiety into a matter of genuine spiritual concern addressed through the Church's own sanctioned rituals of prayer, blessing, and protective devotion practices that formed a normal and expected part of how medieval households prepared for the vulnerable hours of sleep. Chapter Bess, Witches, Maleficium, and the Fear of Harm by Night. The belief that certain individuals possessed the capacity to work harmful magic, referred to in period sources by the Latin term maleficium, carried particular association with the nighttime hours across much medieval popular and increasingly across the later medieval period, official belief. Accusations of witchcraft recorded in surviving court records frequently involved alleged nighttime activity, including claimed gatherings, nocturnal travel, or harmful magical acts believed to have been performed under cover of darkness, whence such activity could proceed unobserved by the wider community. It is important to note that the large-scale witch trials, most commonly associated in popular memory with fear of witchcraft, belong substantially to the early modern period rather than the medieval era itself, with the most intense phases of European witch persecution occurring predominantly across the 16th and 17th centuries. Nonetheless, genuine belief in maleficium and in the capacity of certain individuals to work harmful magic, particularly under cover of night, is well documented across medieval Europe from a considerably earlier period, reflected in penitential texts, ecclesiastical legislation, and occasional surviving legal cases addressing accusations of harmful magical practice, confirming that fear of malevolent human agency operating specifically under the cover of darkness formed a genuine and long-standing thread within medieval nighttime anxiety, well before more organized and intensive persecution of later centuries. Chapter Alt: The Restless Dead. Medieval folk belief across much of Europe held that the dead did not always rest peacefully in their graves, and fear of what later folklorists would term the revenant, a corpse believed capable of rising and causing harm to the living, appears in a number of surviving medieval chronicles and local accounts, particularly from regions of England and Northern Europe, where this belief appears to have particular currency during certain periods of the medieval era. Chroniclers, including William of Newburgh, writing in 12th century England, recorded specific local accounts of restless dead believed to trouble the living at night, offering historians valuable, if necessarily cautious, evidence of genuine contemporary belief in this particular category of nighttime danger. The Church's own official theological position on such matters remained considerably more cautious and skeptical than popular folk belief, generally attributing apparent encounters with the restless dead to the demonic delusion, or entirely natural explanation, rather than confirming any genuine capacity of the deceased to physically return and trouble the living. Yet this official theological caution did little to eliminate the genuine, widely shared, popular fear of encountering something troubling among the graves, or in the darkness beyond a village's boundary after nightfall. Fear that surviving burial customs, including specific practices intended to prevent a feared corpse from rising, suggests worst was taken seriously enough in Jordan communities to shape actual funerary. Chapter Yibam, Fairies and the Otherworld. belief in fairies and related supernatural beings, understood across much of medieval European folklore as inhabiting a parallel, other world, with which human beings might, under certain circumstances, come into direct and often dangerous contact, carried particular association with the liminal hours of dusk and full darkness. Medieval literary sources, including Romance literature and various surviving folk tales recorded or referenced within medieval manuscripts, frequently depict encounters with fairy beings occurring specifically at twilight or during the night, reflecting a broader cultural understanding of these hours as a time when the boundary between the ordinary human world and the other world grew particularly thin and permeable. This body of belief, while existing somewhat uneasily alongside official church teaching, which generally sought to reinterpret fairy belief within an acceptable Christian framework, typically by associating such beings with demonic deception rather than acknowledging any independent supernatural reality, nonetheless persisted as a genuine and widespread feature of medieval popular culture across many regions of Europe, particularly in the British Isles, France, and parts of Germany, where surviving folklore, place names, and occasional documentary references confirm a persistent and deeply held popular concern regarding the particular dangers encountering fairy beings of dark arc, dangers ranging from simple mischief and disorientation to more serious harm, including the widely feared possibility of a person, and particularly a young child, being taken from the human world entirely. Chapter 6. The Fear of the Wolfman. Belief in the werewolf. Person believed capable of transforming into a wolf, most commonly under the light of the full moon, or through some other specific circumstance, appears across a range of medieval literary and legal sources, though its precise prevalence and the seriousness with which it was genuinely believed appear to have varied considerably across different regions and periods of medieval Europe. Medieval French Romance literature, including the 12th century Lie of Bisclevret, composed by the poet Maria de France, engages directly with werewolf belief as a recognized and evidently culturally resonant theme, though such literary treatment reflects imaginative and moral storytelling as much as it necessarily reflects a widely and literally held popular belief in the physical reality of human-to-wolf transformation. More seriously documented legal cases involving werewolf accusation appear predominantly in the later medieval and early modern periods, particularly across parts of France and the German-speaking lands, where surviving court records document actual criminal proceedings against individuals accused of werewolf transformation and associated violent crimes, though the great majority of such intensively documented cases, much like the large-scale witch trials discussed in an earlier chapter, belong more properly to the transition into the early modern period than to the high or central medieval era itself. Nonetheless, the persistent thread of werewolf belief running through medieval folklore and literature confirms that fear of a human capable of transforming into a dangerous predator under cover of darkness formed a genuine, if variably intense element of medieval nighttime anxiety across a considerable span of the medieval period. Chapter Duckus, the Wild Hunt. Across much of northern and central medieval Europe, folk belief held that certain nights, particularly during the darker months of the year, might bring the passage of a spectral hunting party, a phenomenon that later folklorists have generally termed the wild hunt, understood variously across different regional traditions as composed of restless spirits, demonic huntsmen, or figures drawn from older, pre-Christian mythological tradition subsequently absorbed and interpreted within a broadly Christian medieval framework. Encountering this spectral hunt while abroad at night was widely believed across various medieval folk traditions to carry genuine danger, ranging from disorientation and terror to, in some accounts, being carried away entirely by the passing host. Surviving medieval chronicles occasionally reference belief in such phenomena, including brief mentions found within English monastic chronicles, describing being popular reports of a ghostly hunt passing through the countryside at night, evidence that, while necessarily limited and filtered through a particular perspective and purposes of the clerical chroniclers who recorded it, nonetheless confirms genuine contemporary popular belief in this particular category of nighttime supernatural danger across at least certain regions and periods of medieval Europe. A belief that connected the practical, everyday fear of being caught outdoors after dark to a considerably more dramatic and specifically supernatural anxiety regarding what precisely might be encountered on the road at night. Chapter on the weight upon the chest. Medieval folk belief across much of Europe included a specific and widely documented fear associated it with a particular category of frightening nighttime experience that modern science now understands considerably differently. The phenomenon today explained as sleep paralysis, in which a person experiences a temporary inability to move immediately upon waking or falling asleep, frequently accompanied by a genuine sensation of pressure or weight upon the chest, and, in many documented cases, a vivid and deeply frightening sense of a malevolent presence in the room. Medieval folklore across much of Europe attributed this experience to the visitation of a specific supernatural being known in English tradition as the mare, a term that survives directly in the modern English word nightmare, understood as a spirit or demon believed to sit upon a sleeper's chest and induce this genuinely terrifying paralysis and a sense of oppressive presence. This particular fear, grounded in genuine and consistently reported human physiological experience that medieval society lacked the scientific framework to explain in the terms modern sleep science now provides, illustrates with particular clarity the broader pattern running throughout this entire account, in which genuine, universally shared human experience, whether physiological, psychological, or simply the product of profound darkness and isolation, received specific supernatural interpretation within the particular cultural and religious framework available to medieval people. Transforming an experience modern science attributes to ordinary, if unsettling, neurological process into a matter of genuine, actively feared supernatural encounter requiring specific protective folk remedies and religious countermeasures that surviving sources document across a considerable range of medieval regional traditions. Chapter Dying Unschriven. Among the deepest and most theologically significant medieval fears associated with the night was the fear of dying suddenly and unexpectedly without the opportunity to receive church's final sacraments, particularly confession and the last rites, believed essential to a soul's proper preparation for death and its subsequent judgment. Since serious illness, accident, and violent attack all carried genuine additional danger under cover of darkness, when medical or clerical assistance might prove considerably harder to summon quickly. The night carried particular association with exactly this feared possibility of an unprepared, unshriven death, a genuinely serious theological concern within the medieval Christian understanding of salvation and this soul's fate after death. This fear shaped a range of documented medieval religious practice, including specific prayers recommended for recitation before sleep intended to prepare the soul for the possibility of death during the night, and the broader medieval custom of confession and religious devotion, carried out with particular regularity and seriousness precisely because death understood it as potentially arriving at any moment, including during the vulnerable, unconscious hours of sleep, demanded a state of ongoing spiritual readiness that the daylight hours, filled with the more visible and immediate business of daily life, did not impress upon the medieval believer with quite the same persistent nightly urgency. Chapter Lost on the Road. The genuine practical danger of becoming lost while traveling after dark, discussed briefly in an earlier chapter, carried its own particular and well-documented category of fear across medieval Europe, compounded by widespread folk belief in various supernatural phenomena specifically associated with disorientation and misdirection at night. Belief in will-o'-the-wisp phenomena, mysterious lights observed over marshland and boggy ground, believed by medieval folk tradition to lead travelers astray, sometimes fatally into dangerous terrain, appears across a range of medieval and early modern folkloric sources, offering a specifically supernatural explanation for a phenomenon modern science generally attributes to the combustion of naturally occurring marsh gases, yet one that carried genuine, actively feared significance for medieval travelers navigating unfamiliar countryside after dark. Medieval travelers, whether merchants, pilgrims, or simple wayfarers whose business required movement even during the vulnerable nighttime hours, developed a range of genuinely practical precautions against this danger, including careful attention to established roads and known landmarks. The use of whatever portable light source could reasonably be carried, and a strong cultural preference, well documented across surviving travel accounts and practical guidance literature from the period, for securing proper shelter before nightfall whenever circumstances reasonably permitted it. A preference that reflects the same combination of entirely practical caution and genuine supernatural anxiety that shapes so much of medieval nighttime behavior more broadly. Through an equally rich body of practical and religious countermeasures, many of which surviving evidence confirms worms were genuinely and widely practiced, rather than existing merely as abstract belief. The ringing of church bells at specific hours, including the curfew bell discussed in earlier accounts of medieval nighttime life, carried protective as well as purely practical significance in the understanding of many medieval communities, with bell ringing frequently believed to offer genuine spiritual protection against demonic or otherwise malevolent forces active during the hours of darkness, a belief reflected in surviving liturgical and popular commentary from across the medieval period. Household protective practices, including the recitation of specific prayers before sleep, the marking of doorways or thresholds with blessed materials, and the maintenance of small devotional objects or images within the home, appear across a range of surviving medieval sources as genuine, actively practiced responses to nighttime fear, reflecting the broader medieval understanding that protection against the dangers of the dark required active, ongoing religious and practical vigilance rather than passive hope. A pattern of genuine, documented practice that connects the sophisticated theological framework of the institutional church to the actual, lived nighttime anxiety and protective custom of ordinary medieval households across town and countryside alike. Chapter on Dirt, Science in the Sky. Unusual celestial phenomena observed during the night, including comets, eclipses, and other unexplained astronomical events, carried particular weight within medieval understanding as potential omens of impending disaster, divine judgment, or significant historical change, and surviving medieval chroniclers document numerous instances in which such nighttime celestial events prompted genuine, widely shared public alarm and extensive contemporary commentary. The appearance of Halley's Comet in Hensk's Knox, famously recorded within the Bayeux tapestry and connected by contemporary chroniclers to the dramatic political upheaval of that same year in England, offers one particularly well-documented example of how a striking nighttime celestial phenomenon could become woven directly into a community's broader understanding of contemporary events and divine will. Medieval chroniclers across the period consistently recorded such celestial events with evident seriousness, reflecting a genuine and widely shared belief that the night sky itself might offer meaningful, divinely ordained signs regarding the future course of human affairs, a belief that added yet another layer of genuine significance and anxiety to the already considerable body of fear medieval people associated with the nighttime hours, transforming an ordinary night sky, on the rare occasions when it displayed something genuinely unusual, into a matter of intense communal attention, interpretation, and, very often, considerably and well-documented public UNICEF. Chapter Ombes, Teaching Fear to the Young. The considerable body of nighttime fear discussed throughout this account did not remain confined to outbelieved belief and practice, but was actively and deliberately transmitted to medieval children, frequently through explicit storytelling intended, at least in part, to reinforce exactly the kind of nighttime caution and household compliance already discussed in earlier accounts of medieval youthful life. Surviving folk tales and popular stories from across medieval Europe, many preserved only in later written form, but reflecting evidently older oral tradition, frequently features specific nighttime dangers, including many of the supernatural threats already discussed throughout this account, deployed as explicit cautionary elements intended to discourage children and young people from wandering unsupervised after dark. This deliberate use of nighttime fear as a tool of practical child rearing and household discipline reflects a broader pattern evident throughout this entire account, in which genuine practical danger, deeply held religious and folk belief, and the practical necessities of maintaining household order and safety after dark reinforced and reproduced one another across medieval generations, ensuring that the multi-layered fear of the medieval night, built from entirely rational caution, sincere theological conviction, and vivid folk imagination, all woven tightly together, was passed down as a genuine, deeply internalized feature of medieval evil culture, shaping how medieval people of every age understood and navigated the vulnerable hours between sunset and the return of morning. Chapter Anhalt, a continent of different nights. The particular character of nighttime fear varied considerably across the different regions of medieval Europe, shaped by local landscape, climate, surviving pre-Christian tradition, and the particular pace at which formal Christian teaching had absorbed, reshaped, or actively suppressed older regional belief. The heavily forested regions of medieval Germany and Scandinavia preserved a particularly rich body of nighttime folklore concerning forests, spirits, wild huntsmen, and dangerous encounters with the natural world after dark, reflecting the genuine, everyday proximity of extensive woodland to daily rural life across much of northern and central Europe. The more open, cultivated landscape of much of England and northern France produced a somewhat different regional emphasis,
with fear more heavily concentrated on the dangers of the open road and the boundary spaces between one settlement and the next, precisely the transitional zones where medieval folk belief so often located its most feared supernatural encounters. Mediterranean regions of medieval Europe, including much of Italy and Spain, developed their own distinct regional traditions of nighttime fear, shaped by a somewhat different historical layering of pre-Christian Roman and, in Iberia, Islamic and Jewish cultural influence alongside the dominant medieval Christian framework, producing folkloric traditions concerning nighttime danger that, while sharing much in common with the broader European pattern already discussed throughout this account, carried their own particular regional character and emphasis. This genuine regional diversity confirms an important underlying truth about medieval nighttime fear more broadly, that it was never a single, uniform body of belief spread evenly across the whole of medieval Europe, but rather a richly read, locally adopted tradition, shaped by the particular landscape, history, and cultural inheritance of each individual region, even as it shared certain broad, recurring themes in common across the continent as a whole. Chapter on the chronicler who recorded the restless dead. Among the most valuable surviving sources documenting genuine medieval belief in the restless dead is the 12th century chronicle, composed by the English canon William of Newburgh, whose historical work includes a notable and unusually detailed series of accounts describing corpses believed by local communities to have risen from their graves and troubled the living during the hours of night. William's own explicit purpose in recording these accounts as a churchman writing within a broader historical work of genuine scholarly ambition reflected a cautious, investigative approach rather than uncritical acceptance, yet his willingness to record such accounts in careful detail, including the specific communities involved and the practical measures eventually taken to address the feared disturbance, offers historians genuinely valuable evidence of contemporary popular belief taken seriously enough to warrant this kind of careful documentary attention. The specific remedies William describes local communities employing against these feared revenants, including in certain accounts the physical exhumation and destruction of the offending corpse, confirm that belief in the restless dead, whatever its ultimate theological status within unofficial church teaching, translated in at least some documented instances in genuine, practical, community-sanctioned action, evidence that this particular category of medieval nighttime fear extended well beyond abstract belief into the realm of actual, documented local practice, undertaken by ordinary medieval communities genuinely convinced that their nighttime safety depended on addressing the threat directly and decisively. Chapter on Sect, Calling on the Saints. Alongside the more general protective prayers and religious observance already discussed in an earlier chapter, medieval Christians frequently turned to a specific intercession of particular saints, believed to hold spell power to protect against dangers, both physical and spiritual, associated with the nighttime hours. Jadensine saints acquired particular regional or general reputations for protections against specific nighttime dangers, including protection during travel, protection against nightmares and disturbed sleep, and more general protection against demonic assault during the vulnerable hours of darkness, reflected in surviving devotional literature, prayer books, and the dedication patterns of chapels and shrines established along long well-traveled medieval roads, specifically to offer way station protection to travelers who found themselves still journeying as darkness approached. The physical presence of relics, believed by medieval Christians to carry the genuine spiritual power and protection of the saint with whom they are associated, similarly played a role in medieval strategies for nighttime protection, with pilgrims and travelers sometimes carrying small relics or blessed objects specifically intended to offer protection during a journey that might extend into the dangerous hours after sunset. This devotional dimension of medieval nighttime protection illustrates, once again, the deep, thoroughly integrated relationship between practical daily concern and formal religious practice that characterized so much of medieval life, in which the very real, practical danger of nighttime travel found its natural remedy not merely in practical precaution, but in the specific, sanctioned spiritual resources the medieval church offered its faithful. Chapter: Undoubted Charms, Herbs, and the Household's Own Defenses. Beyond the more formally sanctioned religious practices already discussed, medieval households across much of Europe maintained a considerable body of additional folk practice, intended to offer practical protection against nighttime danger, practices that existed in a genuinely complex and sometimes uneasy relationship with official church teaching, which frequently viewed
such folk remedies with suspicion as verging on the same forbidden magical practice condemned in the church's own teaching against maleficium. Surviving penitential texts, which guided confessors in questioning penitents doubt their observance of Christian teaching, frequently include specific questions addressing folk practices, such as the hanging of protective herbs or objects near doorways and windows, or the recitation of charms, whose wording blended Christian prayer with older, evidently pre-Christian formulaic elements, confirming that such practices remained genuinely widespread, despite official disapproval. This blending of sanctioned religious practice, unless formally approved folk custom, reflects a broader pattern, well documented across medieval popular religion more generally, in which ordinary households drew upon whatever combination of practical, religious, and folkloric resource seemed mostly to offer genuine protection against the dangers of the night. Regardless of how neatly such practices aligned with the more carefully defined theological categories maintained by the Church's own official teaching, a turn of pragmatic, blended practice that historians of medieval religion, Bowen, have increasingly recognized as considerably more representative of ordinary, lived belief than the more systematic theological framework preserved in official church documents alone. Chapter Yermin, the moon overhead. The moon held particular significance within medieval understanding of the night. Its changing phases, believed by many to carry genuine influence over human health, behavior, and vulnerability to various forms of danger, a belief rooted substantially in the same broader humoral medical framework. Already discussed in earlier accounts, medieval understanding of the body. Medieval medical and astrological texts frequently associated the full moon in particular with heightened risk of certain forms of illness, disturbed sleep, and even mental instability, a belief reflected in the English word lunatic itself, derived from the Latin term for moon and reflecting genuine medieval conviction that lunar phases could meaningfully affect human mental and physical well-being. This lunar association extended into the folkloric traditions concerning werewolves already discussed in an earlier chapter, with the full moon frequently identified across various regional traditions as the specific trigger for feared transformation, and more broadly, medieval travelers. Communities alike appear to have paid genuine practical attention to lunar phase when planning nighttime activity, recognizing the straightforward practical value of the additional illumination a full moon provided for travel or necessary outdoor activity after dark, even as that same bright lunar light carried its own layer of specific supernatural as association and folk significance within the broader medieval understanding of the night sky's meaningful influence over earthly affairs. Chapter Yemibir, Beards of Elohim. Certain creatures encountered or heard during the nighttime hours carried particular ominous significance within medieval folk belief, reflecting a broader pattern in which the natural world, observed and interpreted through the specific cultural lens of medieval Christian and folk tradition, offered meaningful signs regarding impending danger, death, or misfortune. The owl, whose distinctive nighttime call and largely nocturnal habits made it a creature closely associated with the dark hours across virtually every region of medieval Europe, frequently appears in surviving medieval literature and bestiary tradition as a bird-carrying association with death, ill fortune, or impending misfortune. Its call after dark widely interpreted across various regional folk traditions as a genuine and unwelcome omen. Medieval bestiaries. The popular illustrated compilations of annulations of animal lore that combined genuine observation with symbolic and morally interpretation characteristic of medieval thought, more broadly, frequently reinforced this association between certain nocturnal creatures and ominous meaning, reflecting and further disseminating a body of folk belief that connected the specific sounds and sights of the medieval night, including the distinctive calls of owls and other nocturnal birds, directly to the broader tapestry of supernatural anxiety and meaningful omen that shaped how medieval people experienced and interpreted the darkness surrounding their homes and settlements after the sun had set. Chapter Yumiki, the stranger at the door after dark. The arrival of an unfamiliar traveler seeking shelter after nightfall placed medieval households in a position of genuine and carefully considered tension. Bit between the strong cultural and religious expectation of
hospitality toward travelers, discussed in earlier accounts of medieval communal support and a reasonable, well-founded caution regarding the genuine risk an unknown stranger arriving under cover of darkness might represent. Surviving guidance, literature, and household management treatises from the period reflect this genuine tension, offering practical advice regarding how a household might reasonably extend hospitality while still exercising appropriate caution, including recommendations regarding where within a home an unfamiliar guest might appropriately be lodged, and what precautions a prudent household might reasonably take before admitting a stranger whose identity and intentions could not be immediately verified. This particular nighttime anxiety connects directly to the broader legal concern regarding night walking and unsupervised movement after dark, already discussed in earlier accounts of medieval nighttime regulation. Since a stranger encountered on the road or at the door after curfew fell under exactly the kind of suspicion medieval law and custom directed more generally toward unexplained nighttime movement, a suspicion that, whatever its occasional practical justification, could also fall unfairly upon innocent travelers whose entirely legitimate business simply happened to require movement. During the very hours medieval society had learned, through long and often difficult experience, to regard with particular and persistent caution. Chapter 23. When Plague Walked at Night. The recurring waves of plague that struck medieval Europe, beginning with the catastrophic Black Death of the mid-14th century and continuing in periodic later outbreaks across subsequent centuries, brought their own particular intensification of nighttime fear as communities already. Communities devastated by visible daytime evidence of the disease's terrible toll found the nighttime hours, bringing their own specific and well-documented dread. Surviving chronicles and personal accounts from the plague years describe a genuine fear surrounding nighttime death, since a household member who fell seriously ill during the day might die during the night with adequate opportunity for the proper religious and social rituals surrounding death. That plague conditions had already, in so many other ways, badly disrupted. The night also brought particular practical difficulty to the grim task of managing plague dead, with many afflicted towns and cities overwhelmed by mortality on a scale their ordinary burial customs and civic infrastructure had never been designed to address, resorting to nighttime collection and mass burial of plague victims, a genuinely harrowing practical response documented across numerous virus surviving accounts from the period. One that added its own specific and historically unusual layer of nighttime dread to a population a population already contending with the full weight of the many other fears, both practical and supernatural, that this account has explored, a stark reminder that medieval nighttime fear, whatever its considerable ordinary basis in folklore and everyday danger, could intensify dramatically in response to genuine, extraordinary historical crisis. Chapter 24: The Long Night of the Cloister. Monastic communities, whose distinctive nighttime prayer schedule was discussed in earlier accounts of medieval religious life, understood the dangers of the night through a framework that combined the broader medieval fears already explored throughout this account with a specifically monastic tradition of spiritual struggle against demonic temptation, understood within monastic teaching as intensifying precisely during the vulnerable hours of night, when a monk or nun, isolated in prayer or roused from sleep for the demanding schedule of nighttime devotion, faced particular spiritual vulnerability to distraction, doubt, and demonic assault. Surviving monastic guidance literature, including writings addressed specifically to the proper conduct of monastic life, frequently addresses this particular nighttime spiritual struggle in considerable detail, offering practical and spiritual guidance intended to help monks and nuns withstand exactly the kind of demonic temptation and psychological distress that monastic tradition held to be a genuine and expected feature of the nighttime hours, particularly during the demanding, sleep-disrupting schedule of monastic prayer. This distinctly monastic understanding of nighttime spiritual danger, while sharing much in common with the broader medieval Christian framework already discussed in earlier chapters, developed its own particular intensity and theological sophistication within the specific context of monastic life, reflecting the genuine seriousness with which medieval religious communities approached the spiritual challenges believed to accompany the darkness of night. Chapter 25: Two different kinds of dark. The particular character of nighttime fear differed in meaningful ways between medieval towns and the surrounding countryside, shaped by the genuinely different practical and social conditions each environment presented after dark. Urban nighttime fear, as discussed in earlier accounts of medieval town life, centered heavily on the practical dangers of crime, fire, and disorderly conduct within a crowded, closely built environment where a considerable number of strangers and transient residents moved through the streets even after the ringing of the curfew bell. Dangers that the organized civic watch system existed specifically
to address, however imperfectly, through regular patrol and enforcement. Rural nighttime fear, by contrast, centered more heavily on the dangers of isolation itself. The genuine practical hazard of traveling unfamiliar countryside roads without the reassurance of nearby neighbors or organized civic protection, and a correspondingly richer body of folkloric belief concerning the specific supernatural dangers, including many of those already discussed throughout this account, believed to inhabit the forests, crossroads, and boundary spaces that so thoroughly characterized the rural medieval landscape. This meaningful distinction between urban and rural nighttime experience confirms once again that medieval fear of the dark, however unified by certain broadly shared underlying themes, in practice took genuinely different specific forms, depending on the particular environment, community, and daily circumstance of the medieval person experiencing it. Chapter Irmatzer, what the manuscripts preserve it. Much of what historians today understand about the specific content and genuine seriousness of medieval nighttime fear comes from the patient study of a wide range of surviving written sources, including chronicles, sermons, penitential texts, bestiaries, legal and civic records, vivid literary reference, each offering its own particular angle on a body of belief that was, for the great majority of medieval people who held it, never formally written down out at all, but transmitted instead through oral tradition, practical custom, and the ordinary, largely undocumented rhythm of daily and nightly life. The clerical authors responsible for the great majority of surviving medieval written sources approached popular nighttime belief from their own particular theological perspective, frequently is seeking to reinterpret, correct, or explicitly condemned folk practices and beliefs that departed from official church teaching, a filtering process that historians must account for carefully when attempting to reconstruct the genuine, lived texture of ordinary medieval nighttime fear from sources composed predominantly by uneducated clerical minority rather than by the broader population whose everyday beliefs and practices this account has sought throughout to describe. Despite these genuine limitations, the sheer consistency and richness of the surviving evidence spanning many centuries, regions, and types of documentary source allows historians to reconstruct with reasonable confidence the essential outline of what medieval people across the social spectrum genuinely feared once darkness fell, confirming a picture considerably richer and more textured than any single source alone could provide, one built from the careful, patient combination of chronicle and charm, sermon and folktale, legal record and literary romance, together preserving, across the long centuries since the medieval period itself, a genuine and remarkably detailed portrait of how an entire civilization once understood, feared, and sought protection against the darkness that fell without fail at end of every single day. Chapter Yirmiyedit, the dark we inherited. The story of what medieval people feared after sunset is, in its fullest sense, a story about how an entire civilization made meaning of the darkness it could not eliminate, weaving together entirely rational caution about genuine physical danger, sincere and deeply held theological conviction, all richly imaginative body of folk tradition into a single, coherent, and genuinely lived experience of the night. The traveler hurrying to reach shelter before the last light faded, The household carefully banking its fire and murmuring a protective prayer before sleep. The chronicler recording a troubled community's account of a restless grave, and the child listening wide-eyed to a cautionary tale of fairies or wolves waiting beyond the village boundary, together illustrate a fear does never simple superstition alone, but a genuine, practical, and spiritually serious response to a world, though, that offered no artificial light, no immediate emergency assistance, and no scientific explanation for so much of what a person might see, hear, or feel once the sun had gone down. Much of this medieval nighttime fear did not vanish with the close of the medieval period itself, but persisted, gradually transformed into the folklore, ghost stories, and popular superstition that continued to shape European culture for centuries afterward, and traces of it remain recognizable even today in the lingering cultural resonance of the nightmare, the werewolf, the restless spirit, and the simple, deeply human unease so many people still feel when required to walk alone through genuine darkness. What remains most striking in looking back across this history is not any single fear in isolation, but the sheer thoroughness with which medieval people integrated their understanding of the night into a whole of their religious, legal, and in domestic life, building an entire structure of prayer, law, custom, and story specifically to help them face, night after night, across many centuries, a darkness they could never fully banish, but which, through faith, caution, and the accumulated wisdom of their communities, they nonetheless learned, generation after generation, to survive. For listening. See you in the next stories. Please subscribe and leave a comment.